Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to begin our program for this afternoon. My name is Christina Olney, and I am the Executive Director of the Remembrance Society. Thank you all for joining us today for this incredibly important event. Putin's rise to power through terror, 25 years on, lessons for the Ukraine war. I would now like to introduce the chairman of the Remembrance Society, Congressman Don Ritter, who is going to read a congressional statement and then introduce our moderator for today's discussion. The Honorable Don Ritter is chairman and trustee of the Remembrance Society and a former 14-year member of the U.S. House of Representatives representing the state of Pennsylvania. He served on the Energy and Commerce and Science and Technology Committees as ranking member on the Congressional Helsinki Committee, as the founding co-chair of the Baltic States Ukraine Caucus, and as founding co-chairman of the Congressional Task Force on Afghanistan, and he is a true warrior for the cause of anti-communism and anti-totalitarianism, and served for 18 years on the board of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Thank you, Congressman Ritter.
Thanks, Christina. I want to welcome you all, members of the press, staffers from the congressional offices, friends, guests, colleagues, to this occasion. The Remembrance Society's initial opening salvo happens today. You know, it's a salvo against the scourge on human society of totalitarianism. We're a new organization, 501c3, established just last February. We had our public launching in June, and this, dear friends and colleagues, is our round one in the good fight. We few, we happy, we band of brothers, TRS brothers and sisters, the Remembrance Society, we have come together to engage, to communicate, and to educate a far wider public about the horrific crimes of communism and totalitarianism in general, in ways that remember history accurately and with an in-depth focus that we believe needs a lot more attention than is the case presently. That this depth of focus will come in initiatives like today's, and in the development of a heretofore absent curricula on the subject matter to bring these issues home, particularly to the younger generations, now and in the future. Our founding vice chairman, author, former correspondent, man of all seasons, I would say, David Satter, is in charge of this curriculum development program, and we feel there isn't any that exists that's worthy, and so we are hell-bent on making that happen. The subject of Vladimir Putin's apartment bombings is a perfect example where a prior lack of sufficient attention has contributed way too much to his murderous and dangerous rule over Russia and the death and destruction he has caused around the world. I mean, think Aleppo in Syria, mass bombings of civilians, purposeful, completely. Of course, think Ukraine today. I mean, this is a terrorist at work in the highest order. One last point. This is just the beginning of a TRS, that's the Remembrance Society, apartment bombings initiative to bring home this message to the American and particularly to the Russian people that Vladimir Putin is a terrorist in every sense of the word, and that his mafia, Russia, is indeed a state sponsor of terrorism, a subject of legislation currently before the Congress. I would urge you to stay tuned. And now I would like to, well, I've got a lot of activities up here, so bear with me. I wanted to read to you a statement of Steny Hoyer. Steny and I were very close. I was his ranking member on the Congressional Helsinki for many years, and he and I traveled together a lot. And when you travel with somebody in Congress, that's how you get to really know them. So we met with him last week, and he has offered to give us a statement of his views on what we're all about today. You know, Steny had a mild stroke not long ago, and so he's kind of keeping it cool, but he's in the office every day. I regret that I'm unable to join the Remembrance Society today to mark 25 years since the 1990 Russian apartment bombings. Please know that I too am reflecting on this solemn anniversary. Those terrible few weeks in September '99 revealed Putin for what he is, a peddler of deceit, an enemy of democracy, and above all, a dictator willing to butcher his own people to gain power. A lot has changed in the past 20 years. Putin hasn't. As we speak, he sends young Russian conscripts to die by the tens of thousands in the mud of eastern Ukraine for a war they didn't want. Putin silences all those who oppose his reign, condemning them to the Gulag, or in the case of Alexei Navalny and so many other heroic dissidents, to death. Under Putin's rule, Russia continues to strengthen its ties with authoritarian regimes in China, Iran, North Korea, and beyond. Crucially, Putin continues to lie, cheat, and deceive anyone unwise enough to take him at his word. Too many leaders, Steny says, in the West have fallen into that trap, wittingly or unwittingly, in recent years. They parrot talking points from Russian state media. This is a problem. They claim Putin is trustworthy and urge us to cut a deal with him for peace. Recently, some worked to delay our Congress's effort to secure vital supplementary military aid for our Ukrainian allies. When we fail to remember who Putin really is, we imperil democracy not only in Ukraine, not only in America, but around the world. That's why it's so crucial that we take this opportunity to remember the more than 300 people who lost their lives those frightening September days. In their loss, there is also a lesson. It's a truth I saw time and again through my work on the U.S. Helsinki Commission. I thank you for sharing that lesson today. And one last activity. I have the pleasure of introducing Katrina Lantos Sweat. She is a great lady in her own right. In fact, her parents, Tom and Annette, were probably two of the greatest proponents of human rights in the Congress, in the legislative process, in our national perceptions. And the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree. Katrina, and by the way, I served with her husband for almost, I don't know if he was there for that full 14 years, but we served together in Congress on the Science and Technology Committee. And he's just a great man too, yeah. And they've got, I found out, they have got 16 grandchildren. I mean, wow. 16. So very productive family. Katrina serves as president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, established in 2008 to continue the legacy of her father, the late Congressman Tom Lantos. Under her leadership, the Lantos Foundation has rapidly become a distinguished and respected voice on key human rights concerns. Dr. Lantos Sweat is the former chair and vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom and teaches human rights and American foreign policy at Tufts University. She currently serves as co-chair of the board of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea and the Budapest-based Tom Lantos Institute. It is a great pleasure, Katrina, and you bring me back to a distant past, but a very vital and productive and happy one. All right.
Well, I want to thank you for that very gracious and very warm introduction. It also brings back wonderful memories for me, and I was encouraged to hear the powerful words from our mutual friend, Steny Hoyer. I think everybody in this room understands that we are, at this moment, really in a civilizational battle. The awareness of the depth and the urgency of that civilizational battle sort of seemed to retreat for many years, certainly in the minds of many people. But now we can no longer ignore the challenges around us. So I'm very delighted to be here, and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. As I say, I'm honored to be with you today. And when I was first invited to be part of this event, I'll confess I was not familiar with the mission or work of the Remembrance Society. But I was familiar with your distinguished vice chair, David Satter. Some years ago, when it was first published, I read his brilliant book. It was a long time ago, and it never happened, that recounts the remarkable failure in post-Soviet Russia to face their history and reckon with it. Mr. Satter not only detailed history, but also provided us with profound insights about what the implications are, both for a nation and quite frankly for us as individuals, of such a refusal to look at and wrestle with the truth. These implications are not good. The most obvious consequence of such a failure is the familiar danger that we've all heard referenced time and again, namely that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And this is certainly true. But I think there is another deeper danger that flows from this willful societal amnesia. Whatever is built on this foundation of intentional forgetfulness is fatally poisoned. It is hard to imagine a more compelling case study for this dystopian dynamic than Putin's Russia. Today, in this launch event for the Remembrance Society, we are going to be learning in detail about Putin's rise to power through the use of terror directed against his own people, and how that poisoned genesis has continued to spread its toxin through Russia, through Russian politics, both domestic and international. We are very fortunate to have three outstanding presenters and panelists who it is my pleasure to introduce. I'm going to briefly share their bios with you, although there is much more that could be said. Arkady Yankovsky was a State Duma deputy from 1995 to 2000, when Putin replaced Yeltsin as president of Russia. He represented Novosibirsk, the capital of Siberia, in the Russian parliament. He comes from a family of a repressed enemy of the people. His grandfather was shot by Stalin. In the USSR, Arkady published an underground independent newspaper in his apartment and was elected as a deputy of the local council during Gorbachev's time. During the war with Chechnya, he twice visited Zhokhar Dudayev for negotiations and participated in the exchange of prisoners of war. He is currently a representative of the Congress of Deputies opposing Putin in the United States. Our next will be David Satter. He is the Remembrance Society's vice chairman and director of education programs, a distinguished journalist, historian, the author of 6 books on Russia, and I've only read one of them, so I was apologizing to David. I have to get cracking on catching up there. On 6 books on Russia and the Soviet Union, and a documentary film director. A former Moscow correspondent of the Financial Times of London, he has followed Russian events for almost 5 decades. In September of 2013, he was accredited as a Radio Liberty correspondent in Moscow, and 3 months later, he was expelled from Russia, becoming the first U.S. correspondent to be barred from Russia since the Cold War. Finally, we have Evgeny Savostyanov. He was one of the leaders of the electoral campaign in 1988 of the famous Soviet dissident and academician Andrei Sakharov. After the failure of the August 1991 coup attempt, he personally shut down the headquarters of the Communist Party of the USSR. These are really historic figures we're going to be hearing from today. From 1991 to 1994, he headed the Moscow office of the FSB, and he worked from 1996 to 1998 as deputy head of the administration of President Yeltsin. He later participated in democratic political movements and made a brief run for the presidency of Russia in 2000. In 2009, he initiated a movement for Russian-American rapprochement. He is the author of several books, including Secret Services on the Edge, Democrat and Counter Spy, and I Shut Down the CPSU. We are in for really a feast today. Now, before I turn the podium over to our distinguished panelists, I would like to say a final word about the importance of the Remembrance Society mission. Without a conscious, intentional commitment to the act of remembering, we are adrift, or worse, buffeted in a sea of rapid-fire moments, late-breaking news that comes at us helter-skelter with no context, no narrative, and no real understanding. It is like putting your journey in the hands of a completely unreliable GPS that is in all likelihood infected with malware. And instead of having a map that can give you some sense of how your journey fits in to the larger picture, you are simply reacting minute by minute to the instructions: stop, go, turn right, turn left, yield. We read in Deuteronomy 32:7, remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, he will show you, and the elders, they will teach you. With that, I would like to invite first David Satter to come up and speak to us, and he'll be followed by Arkady and then Evgeny. And after that, we are going to have a conversation up here that I hope will include all of you. So with that, David, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katrina, and thanks to all of you for coming. We're going to talk about what I think is one of the most important issues facing the world, which is the legacy of the 1999 apartment bombings that brought Putin to power. Before I begin, however, I want to show you, or we want to show you, a brief clip from a speech in the State Duma. I'm going to ask Alexei Sobchenko, who is really our fifth panelist. Alexei has agreed to translate for us. He's also a representative here of the Congress of People's Deputies, which is Russia's parliament in exile. In any case, can we show the clip of Vladimir Zhirinovsky in the State Duma? And Alexei, if you can translate if you could just come up here for a moment, and just for those who have difficulty reading the text, the titles.
Пожалуйста, давайте фракция обменяемся мнениями, как нам сегодняшним этим вопросом поступить. Владимир Вольфович.
Оставьте в покое сегодня наших министров. Вы же видите, что происходит в стране. Вспомните, Геннадий Николаевич, вы нам в понедельник сказали, что дом Волгодонский взорван за 3 дня до взрыва. Это же можно как провокацию расценивать. Если Государственная Дума знает, что дом уже взорван якобы в понедельник, а его взрывают в четверг. И в это время мы с вами занимаемся совсем другими делами. Давайте этим займемся лучше. Как это произошло, что вам докладывают, что в 11 утра в понедельник взорван дом, и что администрация Ростовской области не знала об этом, что вам об этом доложили? Все спят, через 3 дня взрывают, тогда начинают принимать меры. Вчера вы очень хорошо говорили о смене руководства Транснефти. А в это время сейчас рабочие в Красноярске отбиваются от такого же ОМОНа, когда Лебедь пытается захватить предприятие, уже давно приватизированное. Давайте быть без двойных стандартов. Если вас интересует Транснефть, других рабочих.
Владимир Вольфович, нас все должно интересовать с вами. Там, где царит беззаконие, мы должны вмешиваться.
Look, David, it is impossible to interpret for Zhirinovsky the way he talks, so I'm going to briefly give you a gist of what he's talking about. He interrupts the chairman of Duma, who tries to offer the agenda for the day, and says, why are we talking about these nuisances when you yourself announced that a house in Volgodonsk was bombed, but the house was bombed 3 days later? How can we discuss anything else if you knew that this house was bombed and announced it by mistake too early?
Thank you. Thank you, Alexei. I think that those of you who watched the clip got a little bit of the sense of the atmosphere in the State Duma when Zhirinovsky raised the obvious question, how could you know that a building was going to be blown up 3 days in advance if you were not part of the plot to bomb the building? For 25 years, ever since those buildings were blown up in the middle of the night, killing hundreds of people as they slept, I've been following the consequences of this terrorist act. In 1999, in the summer of 1999, the atmosphere in Moscow was literally haunted. Everyone understood that Yeltsin had no chance of being reelected, and no one connected to Yeltsin had any chance of being elected president in the upcoming presidential elections. There were all kinds of rumors that some type of provocation was going to take place. Some people said that there would be a war between criminal gangs. Other people said that celebrities would be taken hostage and tortured publicly. Some people said that public buildings would be blown up. And then in September, the buildings of ordinary working people began to be blown up in the middle of the night. At first, I thought maybe it was a gas explosion, but when one after another the buildings were blown up, it was clear that this was a terrorist act. And the Russian authorities at the time quickly blamed Chechens for carrying it out, and it was used to justify a new war in Chechnya. The popularity rating of Yeltsin at that time was 2%. The popularity rating of Vladimir Putin, who was totally unknown in the country, lacking in charisma, and newly appointed as prime minister, was also 2%. But suddenly Putin was everywhere, vowing revenge for the foul attack on innocent Russian people who were murdered as they slept. The bombings were used as an excuse to start a war against Chechnya. Putin was put in charge of that war. And he suddenly changed in the public image from being just a stooge of the corrupt Yeltsin and his corrupt family to being the savior of the nation who was avenging a perfidious attack against innocent people. His popularity rapidly rose. The pre-planned invasion of Chechnya was enjoyed initial success with the help of carpet bombing of civilian areas, despite the fact that it was described as an anti-terrorist operation. And Putin was elected the next president of Russia. And as we know, he has not lost power to this day. And all of this would have been very convincing if it had not been for the fact that the people who perpetrated these bombings began to make mistakes. The first mistake, which was barely noticed at the time, was that Gennady Seleznyov, the Speaker of the Duma, announced a bombing which hadn't taken place. He mixed up the order of the bombings. On September 13th, the building that was blown up was not the building in Volgodonsk. The building that was blown up was the building on Kashirskaya Chaussee in Moscow, which was leveled with 100 people killed or more killed and many more injured. The bomb that blew up the building in Volgodonsk was exploded 3 days later. There is no explanation of how the Speaker of the State Duma could have known 3 days in advance that a building was going to be blown up in a small provincial city in Russia if he had not been informed of a plot to do just that. The anniversary that we're celebrating is the wrong word, that we're marking today is the 25th anniversary of the Ryazan incident, because they didn't stop making mistakes. A group of FSB agents was captured after placing a bomb in a building in the basement of a building in Ryazan, which was defused because alert residents of the building called the local police, and they got there in time to defuse the bomb. The bomb was tested by an explosives expert with state-of-the-art equipment. It tested positive for hexagon, the same explosive that was used in the bombings that were successful. It had a live military detonator. Afterwards, the head of the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, who is one of Putin's closest aides, said that this was not an attempt to bomb a building, this was a training exercise. But according to the law in Russia, to the extent that law exists in that country, any civil defense operation must involve, that in any way touches civilians, must involve the informing of all local officials, none of whom had any idea that such an exercise was taking place. The absurdity of the explanation was such that to this day, it convinced many people in Russia that what was at stake was a deliberate attack, a deliberate attempt to blow up a fifth building. Had it been successful, 400 people would have been killed in the first building. And because the building was located on a slope, the remains of the building would have hit the neighboring building with the force of an avalanche, and it would have destroyed that building as well. There were also 400 people, so 800 people were spared. But the pre-planned invasion of Chechnya began immediately afterward. The United States was well informed about the suspicions surrounding those explosions and the extreme likelihood that this was a terrorist act carried out by the Russian government itself, and chose to remain silent. Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, when asked in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who was responsible for the bombings, she was first asked, "Do you have any evidence that Chechens were responsible?" She said, "We have no such evidence." Then she was asked, "Well, who is responsible?" And she refused to answer. I've since obtained documents under the Freedom of Information Act which demonstrated beyond a doubt that she was hearing the same things that I was hearing, that this was a terrorist act. Our embassy was well informed and chose simply to remain silent, in that way burying the truth about what happened in Russia and clearing the way on Putin's path to power. Now, It's been said that there's been no trial. Putin has not been convicted. We can't say that he and the Russian regime and the FSB were responsible for those bombings. But there never will be a trial until this regime is removed from power. Given the overwhelming evidence and 2 smoking guns, the admission by Seleznyov in the State Duma, and the arrest of FSB agents found placing a bomb in the basement of a civilian building, we are entitled to base all policy on the correct, in my view, belief that these buildings were blown up by the it was actually the Yeltsin entourage and the FSB in order to create the possibility for Putin, who had no support in the population, to create an atmosphere of horror that would make it possible for people to suspend their previous dislike for Yeltsin and vote for what they consciously did not want, which was a successor to Yeltsin, who would protect his corruption. Had we done that and made based our policies on that realization, we would have had a different set of policies. There would be no Ukraine war, because we would have understood what was necessary in order to deter Putin when it was easy to do so. So therefore, and it's important also to point out that all of those who seriously tried to investigate the bombings, Alexander Litvinenko, Anna Politkovskaya, Yuri Shekhachikin, Sergei Yushchenkov, they were all murdered. So in doing this, the time has now come to raise this issue again, to make sure that American society will not regard Putin as a Christian leader, that even the most retrograde and uninformed people in America will not be fooled, and also to reach out to the Russian people themselves so that they understand that this regime is their enemy as well as the enemy of the Ukrainians.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's very important for me to be here today. I, former member of Russian Parliament, represent the capital of Siberia, Novosibirsk. I was a deputy when Mr. Putin came to power by exploding buildings in Moscow and in other cities. I want to explain you maybe 3 moments that I consider important. Let me speak in Russian because I want to be accuracy, and Alexei will translate my speech. Первый момент – это то, о чем попросил Дэвид Саттер, рассказать, какая была атмосфера и реакция в Государственной Думе в эти дни на эти события, на эту речь нашего спикера Селезнева.
The first thing I would like to talk about is what David asked me to highlight: the environment, the atmosphere which was in the Russian parliament at that day, particular day when Seleznyov made this mistake.
Это был шок. Взрывы следовали один за другим. И когда последовал 3-й взрыв, действительно было вот это выступление лидера националистической фракции Жириновского, которое вы видели, фрагмент.
It was a shock because the explosions followed one after another, and then suddenly the Russian nationalist leader, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, made this statement which you just saw on TV, on the screen.
Это совершенно отвязный человек, который говорит все, что ему взбредет в голову, и он, в общем-то, в своем духе сказал то, что ранее другие упустили, не обратили внимания на высказывание спикера 3 дня ранее, как это было сказано.
Zhirinovsky was a loose cannon. you could never predict what he would be able to say. But this time, he was the only one who paid attention to this statement made by Seleznyov, Russian parliament chairman, several days before.
Это выступление, которое вы видели, оно было в самом начале заседания, когда формируется повестка дня, и депутаты имеют всего 1 минуту, чтобы что-то сказать.
The moment when Zhirinovsky took the floor was the moment when the agenda for the day was supposed to be established, and every MP had a chance to say something, so like literally 1 minute to say something. And Zhirinovsky used this opportunity to say what he did.
Он там говорил про нефтяную компанию, ему было важно снять вопрос из повестки дня, связанный с, как лоббист с этой нефтяной компанией. Для этого он применил заготовленный, возможно, вот этот прием с отсылкой к выступлению Селезнева.
Actually, his real task, he was literally working as a lobbyist for an oil company, and he wanted to remove this issue about the oil company from the agenda. And in order to, he used this ploy. He wanted to use this trick to remind that Seleznyov made this mistake. It was, sorry, it was actually not the whole purpose of Zhirinovsky's remark.
Селезнев действительно ранее перечислял обстановку в городах, что есть взрывы и где-то происходят очень напряженные события. И среди этих городов он назвал, в общем-то, никому неизвестный маленький город Волгодонск, когда там еще не было взрыва.
And indeed, Seleznyov, in the beginning of his speech, he mentioned the explosions which took place one after another, 3 explosions by the time. And among the places where those explosions took place, he mentioned completely unknown hole-in-the-wall little town called Volgodonsk, where the explosion did not happen yet.
И никто тогда не обратил внимания на это. Ну, если бы Селезнев сказал, что вот такая-то обстановка, скажем, в Петербурге или в Новосибирске, это не было бы странным. Но то, что он упомянул Волгодонск, а там через 3 дня действительно произошел взрыв, это оказалось странным.
And this is exactly why it attracted attention of the people, because had he mentioned Moscow, St. Petersburg, or Novosibirsk, one of the major cities, people would ignore it mostly. But he mentioned this city which nobody even knew that it existed, so they remember the name. And then 3 days later, explosion happened.
Я не был во время выступления Селезнева в зале, но когда выступал Жириновский, я это очень хорошо помню. Я сидел буквально над ним, через 2 ряда, в кадре нет, но я сидел над ним, рядом Андрей Козырев, бывший министр иностранных дел России, в то время депутат, рядом со мной Константин Боровой. И есть некоторые детали, которые, наверное, важно все-таки сказать.
And actually, I was not there when Seleznyov mentioned Volgodonsk, but I was there when Zhirinovsky made the statement, and I was sitting literally 2 rows above Zhirinovsky, and right next to me were sitting 2 my friends, former Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev, and a gentleman whose name, a deputy whose name was Borovoy, Konstantin Borovoy.
Реакция была молниеносная и очень необычная и Селезнева. И сразу же 2 его заместителя, 2 вице-спикера занялись этим вопросом. Буквально в считанную минуту Артур Челенгаров подошел к одному мне знакомому депутату Александру Лотарев, который известен своим абсолютно нормальным поведением. Спокойный человек, который спровоцировал драку.
And then the response to this statement was very bombastic. One of the Seleznyov, who I remind you was the chairman of the Duma, one of his deputies, Mr. Chelengarov, approached a deputy, как его звали?
Лотарев, Александр Лотарев.
Alexander Lotin, and who
very, very, very cool member
was
of
very,
parliament.
very
I know
quiet,
him.
low-key person.
И надо сказать, Жириновский известен своими драками. Это импульсивный человек, который вот выдает многое. Но в данный момент он вообще был ни при чем. А совершенно спокойный депутат бросил в него папку с бумагами и спровоцировал вот эту стычку. И лишать Жириновского слова нельзя было. Ну, нужно было лишать вот этого спокойного депутата. Но при этом второй вице-спикер, очень авторитетный для коммунистов, вице-спикер Горячего, от коммунистов вице-спикер, поставила вопрос, и Жириновского лишили на максимальный возможный срок, на месяц выступлений в парламенте.
So what happened next was very strange because it is well known that Zhirinovsky loved fist fighting. Whenever he had a chance, an opportunity, he would go and smack somebody's beezer. However, in that situation, it was not him, but this low-key MP Lobov who threw his file into Zhirinovsky's face, and Zhirinovsky, of course, immediately responded with fist fighting. And then another deputy of the Russian Speaker of the Duma, communist whose name was Goryacheva, she suggested to deprive Zhirinovsky to relieve. He would not be allowed to speak for a week.
Month.
A month. I'm
It's
sorry.
maximal.
He was punished by being forbidden from speaking in Duma for a month.
Ну, далее я не буду на этой истории задерживаться, чтобы сэкономить время. Второй фрагмент коротко расскажу. Он связан с расследованием телевизионным, когда
Расследование чего?
расследованием истории с рязанским сахаром.
Okay.
Надо объяснить, что это.
Okay, David already mentioned the story with the Ryazan building where bombing did not happen because people were alerted and the KGB officers were caught. So there was an investigation which Arkady would like to talk about too.
Была известная программа на НТВ, где вот Евгений Вадимович участвовал, и он, наверное, более подробно расскажет о том, как представители ФСБ защищались перед гражданами, которые приехали из Рязани. Это были так называемые учения, рязанский сахар, вы, наверное, слышали.
At the time, there was a very popular independent channel, NTV. I should take liberty and say that this was the first thing Putin did when he came to power. He shut down this channel. So the NTV had a very popular talk show, which was literally a live investigation. And the KGB, FSB we call them now, officers were invited to explain. And Mr. Sevastianov, who is present here, was also present at this talk show, where they decided to figure out where angry people from Ryazan came to this talk show and started to ask nasty questions to the FSB officers.
Я только обращу внимание на один момент, который мне кажется очень важным. У представителей, вот, кто проводил эти так называемые учения, один из аргументов был это то, что исполнители закупили, приехав в Рязань, закупили сахар и его использовали в качестве муляжа. И они представляли фотографии, где действительно на рынке в Рязани они покупают сахар, такие же мешки, и эта фотография фигурировала в этой программе и еще.
In order to save your time, I would like to give you just one interesting detail. The FSB officers, trying to justify their attitude, they said that it was a dry run, it was a practice, it was training, and they just went to a local market and bought bagged sugar. And they showed the pictures of this bagged sugar, which they purchased at the local market. And this picture was running all over the place for many various opportunities in this talk show, including.
Но позднее журналисты, кто анализировал эту ситуацию, в общем-то, опровергли это. И они сопоставили вот время, когда якобы эти исполнители доехали из Москвы в Рязань, закупили этот сахар, И в те дни, в это время была другая освещенность. То есть фотография не могла была в этот день сделать. Она не могла так выглядеть, это была подставная фотография.
However, journalists who started to study this case, they debunked this version, saying that the pictures on the day when the sugar was purchased at the market, and the light they were different, and the day when FSB claimed they made this transaction. So it was a fake picture.
Ну и еще очень много важных моментов, связанных с экспертизой и так далее и тому подобное. Но я вот, завершая свой рассказ, хочу перейти к фрагменту о моем посещении этого дома в Рязани.
I could go on and on providing you with more details about how the FSB failed to provide an explanation for what happened. But I would like to tell you a quick story about my personal visit to this apartment building, which was not blown up by chance.
Это было уже гораздо позднее, через несколько лет, но так получилось, что мой родной дядя, он сейчас жив, он живет в Рязани, на этой улице, которая называется Новоселов, 14. Он живет в доме рядом с тем домом, это 200 футов. Вот это его квартира.
It happened several years later. It just happened that my uncle lives in Ryazan, and he lives literally in the next door to this building on Novoselova 14th Street in Ryazan.
It's Dashkovo-Песочный district of Ryazan. И я разговаривал с ним, и он сказал, что весь микрорайон, эти все люди понимают, что это были не учения. И он сказал, сходи вон к моим знакомым, к соседям в этот дом, поговори с ними.
And he said that everybody in this whole area were convinced that it was not a practice, that it was not a training, it was actually a real attempt to kill people, and you just go yourself and ask them to this next door building.
И я разговаривал с людьми, и особенно один очень мне подробно все объяснил. Люди, которые приехали туда, ну, конечно, они все это прочувствовали, что это реальная была обстановка, но главное, что их изолировали, их продержали, по-моему, сутки. И если бы это были учения, то, конечно, бы команда освободить их, и все это объяснение пришло бы из Москвы. Им на местном уровне потом объяснили, но никто из них в это, конечно, не верит.
And one of the people I spoke to provided me a very detailed story about how they managed to catch these KGB officers who were planting the explosives, and how they were arrested and detained for about 24 hours because local police was not aware who these people were, and they suspected them to be terrorists, and only an order which came from a very high level, from the very top in Moscow, allowed them, forced police to release them and let them go, let the people who planted the explosive devices.
То есть вывод такой, вот помимо всех прямых доказательств, технических деталей, там, химической экспертизы, всего, общее поведение власти по отношению к такому количеству людей и на уровне руководства Рязани и министров, оно не могло быть таким. То есть не могло это продолжаться столь долго. Поэтому вывод и у этих людей, и у большинства, с кем я знаком, из тех, кто был и в политическом классе, и сообщество журналистов России, расследователей, большинство, конечно, не имеет сомнений, что в Рязани готовился очередной взрыв, который предотвращен был, и после этого больше взрывов не было, после того, как КГБ поймали на этой лжи. Я хочу этим закончить свое выступление.
So we have plenty of technical minutiae details which prove that this was a real operation, a real bombing operation, and even the fact that so many people were involved in covering up the story proves that this was a real McCoy, and The people who in Ryazan, they were absolutely convinced that they survived by miracle, and I'm convinced in this by today. This is all what I would like to say.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Catherine, for your kind presentation. It let me think that the bonus of this presentation is that I now understand what people will say on my funerals, because only compliments. Thank you very much. Why this story, why this meeting, this conference is far from being the pure historical study? Why it is so actual today? That's what I want to say from the very beginning. Now we're on the age of the beginning of the New World War. And like before the beginning of World War II and before the beginning of World War III, which was named Cold War, the nations of democratic countries are very much relaxed, and they don't feel and don't understand that situation is growing from normal to abnormal, and they must meet it, not relaxed and not living under the rules of peaceful time. Governments of these countries already, with great losing of time, with great delay, they understood the situation. But it's very important now to let people understand, common people who come and vote, to understand their responsibility for the future of their children. The situation looks very much like the picture that was described by Winston Churchill, who said that his predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, he understood that Hitler is an evil, and he rules the Germany in a manner that will come to the Great War. But he said, I cannot underline it, because in this case, on the nearest elections, I will lose, because people don't understand. I will lose to the laborists, and laborists will let Hitler do much more than I. And this is why, that is why it's so important to use this chance, to use this conference, to use all other possibilities, to let people understand that great evil come to them, great evil brought by Putin. Not him only, because we have Xi in China, we have rulers of Iran, but we today speak about Putin. Why he was involved in this war? Because he needs to secure his all-time government. And by the way, today we mark not only 35 jubilee of explosions in Moscow, but we mark also the 35 jubilee of governing of Putin. He became the prime minister and official successor the same year. So 35 years, 25 years, this man is in power, and he never wanted to leave the power. And he used the war as a tool to secure his power, because only the situation of the terror, only the situation of the country surrounded by enemies permits him to rule and permits him to give some kind of support and arguments to be a permanent ruler. But why? But why he used this tool to rule forever? Because at the beginning of his ruling was the terror. You shall understand that the events of those days are very actual today, because the terror was at the very beginning and the terror continues now. As for me, the picture became more or less evident during one event that happened approximately a week after Putin was approved by the parliament as a prime minister of Russia. This was a meeting of experts. That meeting was held by one very prominent Russian scientist and politologist, Alexei Salmin. And we discussed what will be the result of the president's elections. That time people thought they will happen not not extraordinarily, but according to the common procedure, is the summer of 2000. And one of the people who participated in this meeting, he said, the decision to approve Putin like a prime minister and successor was one of the most stupid decisions of Yeltsin, because there is no normal way under which Putin may be elected as the future president of Russia. Opposite to me was sitting one guy, his name is Alexander Aslon, who headed the fund of the social opinions, the main sociology center that served for Putin's election campaign later. At that time, he demonstrated him like simply one of those close to a presidential administration. And he was the most close to presidential administration, head of sociology service. So, hearing the words that there is no any normal way Putin may be elected like a president of Russia, he was sitting, writing something on the table, and he didn't even raise his head. He was sitting, but he made such a glimpse and murmured in a manner that maybe besides me nobody heard his words. And if not in a normal way. Because I knew that he is involved in the discussions in the president's administration, what to do, I immediately understood that first, they also knew that Putin is not the person who could be elected in any normal way. Second, they tried to find a normal way to elect Putin. What way it could be? To understand it, you shall remember that in those days, already there was military battles in Dagestan, in the part of Russia where Chechens invaded and the battle started, but public opinion didn't react to it. You see, in Russia, the battles in some south region, very far from them, was not a matter to be very much obscured. And even the explosions in the city of Buynaksk, at the south of Russia, also didn't change the public opinion. Somewhere far from us, it's not very interesting. And so people around Yeltsin, they understood this war on the south border is not enough to change the moods of Russian people. They need some more effective drug, more hot drug. And when I found out, when I first heard about those explosions, I immediately understood this is a normal way that they found to provide, to secure Putin's elections. From that moment on, they used it. By the way, it was a very risky game, because if Putin's opponents, political opponents, that time, the previous Prime Minister Primakov, for example, were more politically skilled, they could use this chance to dig down Putin, who was the head of the FSB and the Security Council at the days when the military operations, when the war with Chechnya started, second war with Chechnya started. But they missed their chance, and Putin and his staff, they realized it. They realized it, and they developed the campaign, which finally led Putin to become the president. But I want once more underline that it was a moment when I personally understand. They know there is no normal way to elect Putin, and they need to find some other hot way to do it. So we can, of course, discuss different features, how the explosions were made, what operation was developed, but we know what was the base, and we know what was the result, and what is more important, we know the practice of 25 following years that Putin always was on this road, the road to take power and not let anybody take power again, to have independent investigation that could open what was the first step of Putin to power. Thank you.
Well, I suspect that all of you, like I am, are just stunned at sort of the testimony we've heard. Some of you may already have been familiar with this sordid history. For others of you, it may be more of a revelation, but it is unbelievably appalling. And of course, one of the implications going forward is that when the ruler of a country takes power through what can only be described as sheer evil, an act of sheer evil and terror perpetrated against his own citizens, clearly that is someone who knows they can never afford to relinquish that power voluntarily, can never afford to step aside, because eventually that truth comes out. And so it creates a very, very dangerous dynamic. I have so many questions for these brilliant men, but I want to make sure that you all get involved. And this gentleman right here in the front row was signaling me, so I'd like to go to you first for a question, if I may.
If you have questions, it doesn't mean that we have answers.
I don't think that's true. I think these guys have answers.
Hello, everyone. I'm Edward Lucas, and I was the Moscow bureau chief of The Economist from 1998 to 2002. So I have some familiarity with this story. And the thing that I find so shocking, and I'd love to know the panel's opinion of this, is that if you look at the opinion polling in the years afterwards, it's clear that a very large number of Russians believe that this was an act of state-sponsored mass murder. It comes up in all sorts of opinion polls. Do you believe the official story that it was Chechen terrorists, or do you believe that this was a provocatio of the FSB, or whichever way you phrase it? It's a big chunk. I mean, the numbers vary, but it's sometimes 30, 40, up to 50%. And yet this comes at a time when Putin's popularity was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And what that means arithmetically is there are people in Russia who believe that the authorities blew up hundreds of defenseless fellow citizens in the middle of the night. They believe that the authorities have lied to them, and yet they still support Putin as president. And I find that a really horrifying and revolting paradox. And I'd be very interested in the thoughts of the panelists on how it can be.
Why don't we just go down the line? And Alexei, we are so grateful for you as translator. I know, as David said, you're a very significant voice in your own right. David, why don't you go first?
Yeah, while Alexei is, there's something that it's important to understand about Russia, which is that, and Napoleon actually identified this many years ago when he said there are really two countries in Europe. There's Russia and everyone else. And the reason is that Russia is not so much a country as a movement, and it has the psychological construction of a movement. And in a movement, I mean, we have movements in the West, but they exist within the framework of a country. In Russia, the movement is the country. And in according, in an
What is the, describe the movement, if
Well,
you would,
yeah.
what you mean
in
by
a
that.
in a movement, everyone is concentrated toward a single goal, from which people derive their sense of significance. The individual counts for nothing and is completely expendable. I mean, we see that now, of course, in the Russia-Ukraine war with the human wave attacks. And by some estimates, we now have 1 million casualties as a result of this war. And it was correspondents who went to the scene of the bombings after they took place and interviewed the residents were told by the residents that it was done by the FSB. And then they were asked who they were going to vote for, and they said they'll vote for Putin. Because, in fact, for a large section of the Russian population, it's perfectly normal for politicians to struggle for power in this manner. And they suspect, and this idea is encouraged by Russian official media, that other countries would do exactly the same thing. And in any case, what is missing in Russia, and has been missing for decades, is the idea that individual human life is worth something. Even now, when we look at the Russia-Ukraine war, when a family loses a son or a husband or a relative, there's grief. But the idea that hundreds of thousands of people are being killed, that has no effect, because the movement has been inculcated with the idea that it is only through sacrifice that they can achieve their great goal. And therefore, the mentality of the movement directly contradicts and conflicts with the notion of the worth of the individual. And for that reason, in Russia, and until that mentality is changed, and this is what we're talking about here, is historical truth as a means of changing that mentality. But until it is changed, we're going to get these very paradoxical results, that people are aware that the regime carried out acts of mass murder against its own people, but they don't have the moral sensibility to recognize that was wrong, and that in fact it poses moral issues which supersede the interests of the movement.
Yes, please.
I just want to illustrate what David just said, because after 9/11, I happened to be in Moscow. At the time, I was a State Department employee, and I met my old friends from Moscow University who were basically sharing with me all at the time, back when I used to live in the Soviet Union, we didn't like communism, but what I was shocked by, struck me at the time, is that not only my friends were convinced that FSB blew up the buildings, but they also believed that CIA blew up the World Trade Center. And they said, well, this is the same logic, this is how they operate. And, if we did, why couldn't you guys do the same thing? So, and I was trying to explain to them that this is unthinkable, unfathomable. No. We know better than that.
Oh my gosh, so many questions. I'm going to ask one quickly, and then I'm going to turn it over to all of you. So, David and Arkady and Evgeny, you have touched very briefly on sort of the Western failure to act upon the evidence that was presented and the evidence that existed about the truth of this, and that there was somehow nonetheless this willingness to go forward and treat, Putin as a normal leader. You talked about how he could not be elected through any normal process. To what extent do you lay some of the blame at the feet of Western governments and Western intelligence agencies for not aggressively bringing this to light? Because my expectation is if you walk down the street and asked well-informed people who would have some recollection of those terrible bombings, the overwhelming majority of people in the West would say, oh, yeah, Chechen terrorists, right? That was Russia's fight against terror. So how did the West drop the ball in such a shocking way? Maybe Evgeny, if you want to take a crack at that first.
You see, you have touched a very, very big problem. And this episode is just an episode of this problem, because when the Cold War was over, the great goals were over, the leadership in the Western countries came people with the mentality of accountants, of burgomisters, of municipal level. They were not politicians, and they missed an opportunity to be involved in reshaping of the world. They, under unknown reasons, they supported China government and after the Tiananmen massacre.
Yeah.
And they created all possibilities for China to become the superpower which it's now. And at the same time, they did nearly nothing to support Russian democratic forces when they took power in Russia. So the answer is very simple. There were no big politicians in the Western world after the Cold War. Very simple. That's why I'm sure that now comes new times and new big politicians will come to power in the West. But not now. That time was missed. And when we speak about, I want to answer the previous question. Don't you think that you can repeat your question, for example, to the German people after the World War II? Why, for example, didn't you understand that the fire of Reichstag was a provocation? Why did you support Hitler under these circumstances? It's the first answer. When nations have big and momentarily success, you see in Germany, after the Big Depression, and in Russia after revolution, people were in poverty. Immediately, Hitler and Putin changed their situation. They changed, people started to get money. People start to feel themselves more protected from social and economic point of view. They didn't think about the rise of oil prices, but they thought very strictly, here is Putin, and now I get money. Here is Putin, and now Chechnya is under the bombing, and no more explosions in Moscow, in other cities. So, two factors, change of mind, and I forgot to add one very important feature more. Russia is not a European country. As Turkey, Russia is only partly European country. And Russia is a country with more Asian story than European story.
I'd like to say something about this because, for 25 years I've been trying to call the world's attention to the truth about the apartment bombings, and it was really profoundly discouraging to see the level of the journalistic, scholarly, and diplomatic understanding of Russia, and the failure to think outside of comfortable stereotypes. And why was it that we object whenever there's any hint of election interference, and we do it publicly in various countries abroad. But when we had evidence that FSB agents were caught putting a bomb in a civilian building, we said nothing. And Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, in effect, created a situation in which the State Department had no institutional memory. Because after she left, there was no record of any objection or any questioning of what had happened. You know, in Germany, after the Night of the Long Knives, when Hitler ordered the massacre of the leadership of the SA, the British newspaper, The Telegraph, had a headline, Hitler stamps out mutiny like a gangster. And then the British forgot that he was a gangster. And everything was preordained, and it was the same situation here. The refusal to look, the refusal to learn the lessons, and by the way, the desire to protect careers and to pretend that they knew more than they did know on the part of people who were striving for high office. Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered in 2015, and I spoke to someone who became, one of the formulators of the so-called reset policy after the nuclear poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko, who, by the way, tried to expose the apartment bombings. And we said that Putin was dangerous and needed to be deterred, and had absolutely, he was incapable of making any counter-arguments, but he certainly wasn't going to go into the Obama administration and try to explain the real situation to someone who believed that all of the problems in U.S.-Russian relations were the fault of George W. Bush and had nothing to do with Russia's own behavior. So we are a victim of our superficiality and provincialism, and if we want to deal with the Russia-Ukraine war now, we have to do better in the future than we've done in the past.
Arkady, did you want to add something?
Some words more. Today, Russian people lives under the propaganda 7 days a week, 24 hours. We have very short period of our history with freedom, very short, and that time was hard economically for people. And now I have question for your power. Maybe it's not enough quantity of Russians understand what kind of Putin's regime is. And Americans too. Americans live their own life. And our task to explain them. But our power, your president, they have discussions connecting with Putin. Now, today, I know Zelensky is here in DC. What will be? Explanation for Zelensky, don't worry, say Biden's administration. It's my opinion. So we need, in the whole world, all peoples understand what kind of Putin's regime. It's Hitler #2. Yeah. It's my opinion. Thanks.
Yes, please. Yes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Привет, добрый день, как дела, дамы и господа. I'm Chris Orr, former U.S. Air Force officer, current senior defense editor for National Security Journal, and last but not least, proud TRS supporter. My question would be primarily directed to Evgeny, although I certainly welcome input from any of the panelists. Or we talk about the FSB, the Federalная служба безопасности, and their role in the bombings. What about Spetsnaz, the Russian military special force? After all, Spetsnaz is highly trained in the morbid art of dealing death, or to use the Russian euphemism, mokriya dela, wet work as in wet with blood. So is there any evidence that Spetsnaz had either direct or even at least an indirect role in the bombings? Большое спасибо.
I usually say to my fellow Americans, I will understand you much better if you speak a little bit slowly.
Мог ли спецназ быть вовлечен в взрывы домов? Потому что мы говорим только про ФСБ,
Do you mean military spetsnaz? I think zero. You see, special operations, spetsnaz is well trained. They can do it technically. But it's not necessary to involve them in these operations. Under the law, they cannot work on the territory of Russia. of course, it's only theory. But in fact, I see no reasons to involve such people from Ministry of Defense. They're politically much more neutral. So a chance for a leakage of information in this case is much higher. That's why I don't see any possibility of the role. Talking not about this case, I shall mention that in FSB there were two big departments, Alpha and Wimpel. Wimpel was prepared for terrorist operation, diversions and terrorist operation, Alpha for counter-terrorist operation. Both were under my commandment for some time. And by the way, I want to add a few words to the previous question. I headed a lot of anti-terrorist operations to take hostages from terrorists. By the way, even United States citizens. What was a big surprise to me from the first cases, that it was enough 2 days for so-called Stockholm syndrome developing in hostages. In 2 days, you take people from terrorists and feel they have more sympathy to terrorists than to you. The same situation with the Russian nation. Russian nation is ill with Stockholm terrorism, Stockholm syndrome.
The lady here in the center, thank you.
American. I would love to hear what particularly citizens of the Russian Federation, I don't know if you still have the citizenship or not, I actually don't know, but because you know Russia so well, what is in your opinion, needed to bring about change within Russia? If you read what Vladimir Putin is saying, he says that the change will come and it'll be really unexpected. Yet we see that young students in Russia are being prepared to be soldiers. They're being brainwashed by same movement goals that David was speaking about. And as a Georgian American, I feel really saddened by what Putin has done to his own people, but he's also hurting people around the Russian Federation, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, the list goes on and on. So how can we help bring about the winds of positive change, or is this a lost cause? Thank you.
Who would like to go first? Because it's a question with a little tinge of hope for hope.
I know what
Yes.
Arkady is going to say, so I'm going to...
Please, please.
The answer is, so far, and this is I can go on talking about it, but the word regime change is taboo in this city. After we failed in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, the word regime change is a taboo. Nobody wants to talk about it. But Putin is not going to go by itself. Even if the Ukrainian army reaches its international borders of 1991, Putin is going to stay there. So we need to seriously start to look at the Russian opposition forces, which are not just talking for sake of talking, but who are talking about that Putin must go. If Putin stays, the war continues, we're going to all have troubles. I'm sorry. Значит, вопрос был такой, могут ли, что должны делать на Западе для того, чтобы в России...
Тогда переводи.
The answer is very simple and short.
Самый сложный вопрос. More difficult question.
The answer is very short and simple. Support Ukraine.
I'd like to add something to this. I think that, the truth itself will not make a difference, but under some circumstances, it could be very decisive. If Ukraine begins to prevail in the war, I saw during I was in the Soviet Union. I was correspondent of the Financial Times during the Soviet period. I lived in the Soviet Union for 6 years. And during that time, it seemed absolutely hopeless. The broadcasts of Radio Liberty, the attempts of people to somehow provide truthful information to a nation that was that was living in a structure of lies. But when the change came to the Soviet Union, everything that had been said by Radio Liberty, everything that was, and the Voice of America, and that was somehow at some level preserved in the minds of Soviet people, immediately became the new reality. It didn't happen gradually, but under the right circumstances, and by this I mean, just as Yevgeny says, if there is victory or the beginning of victory by the Ukrainians, the story of the apartment bombings can be absolutely decisive, because people understand that they're being treated as cannon fodder, and this is kind of a murder machine. And nothing shows it better than the way in which Putin came to power.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. We're going to go.
One person, there's after George, there's
Yes.
Nastya Popova, who's way in the back.
Yes,
And
okay.
Yeah, all right, go ahead, yeah.
Please, here, and then Nastya.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to ask anyone in the group the very obvious question. You talk about the downfall of Putin, the eventual overthrow of Putin. We would hear this in Libya. Gaddafi, we were told, was so bad. He doesn't look too bad when you see what you have there, which is the Wild West, basically. So many people in this country didn't like the Shah, and they saw what's come after him. Well, he looks pretty good in retrospect. And you could give a lot of examples of this. Be careful what you ask for. Cuba, going back to when people condemned Batista and what followed. My question is simply this. If Putin were to die or somehow be overthrown, if a future Prigozhin could take him out, what would happen? Who would be in charge?
Good question. I think they're all going to want to answer that. I think you're going to get all 3 of our experts weighing in, please.
There are 2 universal laws of Russian history by Sebastianov. First law, each next president of Russia, each next leader of Russia turns foreign policy 180 degrees. You know, you will find no exceptions. Each new ruler of Russia change his Russian foreign policy to the contrary, not changing the internal policy. Internal policy in Russia changes in 12 years, more or less. So next ruler of Russia, he of course will stop the war in Ukraine immediately, undoubtedly, be sure. That's why this problem is only until Putin lies. But the changes in Russia may happen only under the pressure of the West. It's just the case that happened in the beginning of 70s, when the Helsinki Conference happened. Leonid Brezhnev, he suggested to make 2 big agreements. Security of European coexistence and trade of Europe, free trade and economic benefits of trading with each other. The West at that time added the 3rd basket, the human rights. And it influenced the Soviet Union, it influenced the Soviet Union. What I want to say, don't repeat mistakes. When the time of changes will come to Russia, they will come. Don't support the regime until it provides the increase of human rights. The support in exchange of human rights.
Anyone else want to address this question?
Это самый сложный вопрос, конечно, и мы ломаем голову над этим, как все может быть.
This is the most complicated question, and all of us, we are thinking about it nonstop. What might happen.
Мы все думаем, что есть вариант прихода нового Горбачева. Это было была оттепель при Хрущеве после Сталина и была оттепель при Горбачеве. Вот все пытаются просчитать такой вариант.
In Russian history of 20th century, there were two thaws. One was after Stalin died and Khrushchev came to power, and one after Brezhnev died and eventually Gorbachev came to power. This is what basically are our hopes for. We hope for.
Я думаю, что в Соединенных Штатах Америки очень серьезная разведка, серьезная аналитика, и они знают прямо разговоры, кто какие принимает решения на самом верху, что происходит вокруг Путина. Я думаю, что все известно.
I hope that U.S. intelligence, that U.S. Analytical services are quite powerful too, and they are aware about what's going on, what kind of conversations they talk about up there in Kremlin around Putin.
По всем признакам, которые вот я ощущаю и понимаю, мне кажется, что угроза применения ядерного оружия снижается сейчас.
My sense is that the threat of the nuclear war is going down.
Да, есть риторика, есть блеф, но на самом деле нынешняя власть не может и не сможет применить.
Yes, they talk about it. There is lots of fiery rhetoric, but they are incapable to use nuclear weapon in a military in a war.
После Государственной Думы я работал в Счетной палате Российской Федерации. Это орган, ну, в котором много отставных депутатов, и рядом со мной в офисе сидел один бывший генерал, который руководил группой ядерного чемоданчика. Есть такая должность.
After retiring from Duma, I was working in this so-called accounting chamber where many former legislators move. And one of my colleagues was a former military general who was responsible for the nuclear briefcase. There was a team called responsible for, in charge of nuclear briefcase.
Ну, вот сопоставляя все, так как мы понимаем, там это устроено, сопоставляя те расклады внутри вот этого путинского политбюро, мы понимаем, что реальный внутренний раскол. Первое, Путину не дадут возможность применить ядерное оружие. Второе, настанет такой момент, когда внутри элиты, этой самой верхней, возникнет ситуация конфликта. И вот здесь наш шанс, что будет новый Горбачев. И этому надо способствовать, и, наверное, специальные люди, наверное, тоже могут этому способствовать.
By using all this information which I have, which I heard from this general, I can presume that there is a split in the Russian elites, and the people who are in charge of, I presume, the nuclear briefcase, including, they would not allow Putin to use it, to employ the nuclear weapons. And there is a hope for a new Gorbachev. Is there, may I just add very quickly? Now, I have a very simple argument for give you some hope. Russian elites, once they stole all this money from the people and they invested it in the West, they enjoyed their very luxurious lifestyle in the West. For them, to spend winter vacation in French ski resort Courchevel was extremely important. For them to go to yachts, to enjoy the summer vacation on the yachts going from Sardinia to the shopping in the French and Paris and in Milan was a part of their lifestyle. Basically, their whole philosophy was to show off. And you could not show off in Novosibirsk, in Moscow, in Ryazan. This was not the place where they would enjoy. So once the war started, there were several telephone leaks where rich Russians were cursing Putin, saying that you know, what a stupid idiot, he brought us into this war, and we cannot bring our girlfriends to Miami. We cannot go. For them, this was the purpose of their life. This was the reason why they would make so much money. They would make them in Russia and spend them in the West. So once Putin is gone, all what they would like to do is get back to the West. get back to the chalet in the mountain, in Alps, get back to the villa in Florida. They would like to get back this lifestyle, and they would be willing to sacrifice any national, sacred, holy Russian idea for sake of getting back to this material benefits of spending their money in the West.
We're going to have one final question from the woman in the back. Thank you.
Thank you. Anastasia Popova, Khodorkovsky Foundation, US. I have a question to Arkady regarding the incident that we saw at the beginning of this event and to which you referred during your opening remarks. So I understand that Zhirinovsky was deprived of the ability to speak during parliamentary sessions for a month. However, aside from Zhirinovsky, as far as I remember, there were 499 other elected members of parliament, including yourself. So unlike in the Duma, where I had the privilege of working, I understand that during that Duma, there was such thing as freedom of speech and basic democracy. So why didn't you and other MPs speak up and raise public awareness about what happened? And what did you do as an elected official to protect the people who elected you and democracy in Russia? Thank you.
Это обсуждалось. Это были дни, когда в стране была паника, был хаос. И на самом деле то, что сказал Жириновский, не сразу вспомнили, стали искать в стенограмме, а в стенограмме ничего не оказалось. И в целом, даже в журналистских кругах, вы вспомните, в те дни, по крайней мере, на это не обратили внимания после его выступления. Это было все гораздо позже.
In those days, the country was grasped by panic and horror. And when we started to recall what Zhirinovsky said, we wanted to see it in the minutes of the protocols of the Duma meetings, and we couldn't find his words. It was deleted. And so the journalists started to think about the meaning of what Zhirinovsky said only way later.
Кроме того, дополню, вот перед сегодняшней пресс-конференцией мы с Евгением Вадимовичем Савастьяновым как раз вспоминали этот случай, и вот он, например, новую информацию мне сказал о том, что был действительно взрыв, мелкий взрыв, какая-то бандитская разборка в этом городе. И формально невозможно вот уличить и доказать. И, может быть, действительно был такой взрыв. А может быть, он выдуман или мало ли в городах каких взрывов. Поэтому вот так вот абсолютно доказывать, никто не взялся. Нет этой фактуры, понимаете?
Besides, Mr. Sevastianov just reminded me about this episode before we started this event. There was some kind of little explosion. Most likely it was the local gangs fighting each other in this little town of Volgodonsk. There was something, and in the beginning, we were a little bit confused and were not sure that this big one explosion and this little one explosion, which was mentioned before, were not the same thing.
I just want to say one thing about that little explosion. Seleznyov offered that as the explanation. He said there was an explosion, but it happened on the 15th. So how did he know about that explosion 2 days in advance? That was just, they learned later that when people began questioning them about the big explosion, they found that, they checked the police records and found that there was something close to that date, but they still couldn't have known about that 2 days in advance. It did, but it created enough confusion so that people did not focus on the meaning of what Seleznyov had said.
Well, I want to thank this incredible panel. This has been really sort of an extraordinary afternoon we have spent together. And I think it has underscored how absolutely crucial the mission of the Remembrance Society is. There is an incredible amount of work that needs to be done, educating, reminding, and warning the population at large, our leadership, about the threat that we face, because truly we are at a moment of great civilizational threat. In sort of pulling things together, I want to borrow from something Evgeny said and a word that you used, David, in response to the question, what can we do? Is there any hope for change in Russia? You said two words: support Ukraine. You, David, used the word superficiality, the curse of superficiality that we are battling against in so many countries, including the United States. And I cannot help but think about the little town in New Hampshire that I come from, Bow, New Hampshire, population around 7,000. And I can tell you that in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was an enormous upsurge of passionate commitment to the United States standing with the brave people of Ukraine. The United States showing Putin that he could not get away with this outrage. And in every third house, you either saw a Ukrainian flag flying in their front yard, or maybe they wrapped their mailbox in yellow and blue, or they had a sign out or something in their window. And there was actually an extraordinary sense of support and community. And if that was happening in my little hometown of Bow, it was happening in thousands of communities across this country. Now, 2 years on, my Ukrainian flag, which is getting a bit tattered, is the only one I see as I drive through my little hometown. And I think there is a warning and a lesson to us in that as well. Finally, and I didn't get Christina's permission to do this ahead of time, but I think I should mention, because this is obviously a group deeply concerned about Russia, about Putin, about the threat to the values that we hold most dear: democracy, human rights, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. And on Thursday, so just a few days from now, the Lantos Foundation is actually going to be giving our Lantos Human Rights Prize to two very brave women. We call them accidental human rights heroes. One is Svetlana Tishkanuskaya, who is the president-elect in exile of Belarus. And the other is Evgenia Karamursa, the wife of Vladimir Karamursa, who never expected to herself become a human rights crusader, but when her husband, twice poisoned by Putin and then arrested and sentenced to 25 years in prison, was behind bars, she knew she needed to step up. And a true joy that we never anticipated is that her remarkable husband, Vladimir, will be there to help present the prize to his wife. So I want to extend a tentative invitation to all of you to join us, because it's already very well subscribed, but I think there are probably still seats there. It's going to be at the U.S. Institute of Peace. So if you have an interest, you're most welcome to go to our website, lantosfoundation.org, and if there are still seats and tickets available, we'd be honored to have you, because I do feel that this group, more than any other, understands what is at stake and understands how crucial this fight we are in is. So please join me in thanking this outstanding panel, thanking the chair of the Remembrance Society, and thank you all for being here.
I just wanted to also echo some of your words, Katrina, and thank Evgeny and Arkady, and of course, the great centerpiece of our work in this field, David Setter. Katrina, you are amazing in the way you can sum up situations like this. And I would also make that same request to those in this room to join us, be part of what we do. We're emerging, so there's a lot of room for innovation. And hope you guys can stay with us, be with us. I should mention one other thing. From November 11th to November 14th in Prague, we are collaborating with the USTR, the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, in putting on a major conference. It will be in some very nice places. The Liechtenstein Palace for the day's conference, and the Lubkovich Palace for our dinner, which the Remembrance Society is supporting. We're hoping that Prime Minister Fiala is going to keynote this event. And of course, if you can get to Prague, you're all welcome. Anyway, onward with the Remembrance Society. Thank you all very, very much.